All right, we're here for chapter 2, another one of our video lectures. I hope you're all doing well. I hope the presentations are helpful and easy to digest, just maybe a fun way to review some of the content from the chapter and the slides. Again, if you have any questions, always reach out, and I hope everyone's doing well. Little overview. This will be hopefully not too long. This is a lot of information about the brain, neural communications, the nervous systems, the endocrine system, and then brain states, consciousness, dreams, and some other fun stuff. So we'll review it again. There's a little bit more slides that you guys will have available, and then there's a lot of content in the chapters. We talked a little bit about last time psychology having a biopsychosocial focus, and biology is a big part of psychology. So the human brain constantly changes and adjusts to new experiences, and this is called plasticity, the brain's ability to change by reorganizing after damage or building new pathways based on experience. This is a recent phenomenon that's been considered in neuroscience, and later in the slides, there's a cool example of just how plastic or formable, moldable the brain is. It's not some concrete thing that's fixed. It's very malleable and it's very plastic. Biological psychology, the scientific study of links between biology and psychology and the processing between them. A lot of interesting developments have happened in psychology since it's gotten more familiar with biology. Originally, when your fathers of psychology, Freud and a lot of Wundt and other people, were stepping away from medical science and biological sciences, and psychology was viewed as less of a science, and now it's been paired up with those again, and it's gained a little bit more recognition. One of the big areas of biology and psychology meeting is cognitive neuroscience. This is an interdisciplinary study of the links between brain activity and cognition. And cognition is your way of mental processing. If you remember, psychology is defined by the science of behavior and mental processing. So there's a lot of different parts to the brain, and your cognition is what their interaction makes up. So that processing of information and your thinking, everything is related to your cognition. In this cognitive neuroscience, you'll study perception, thinking, memory, language, and a whole slew of other things. It's a pretty broad topic, but very interesting, very challenging, and fun stuff for psychology. So we're going to discuss now some of the physical features of the brain. Everything, again, that we discuss in this class will just be a sneak peek, just the tip of the iceberg. There's an infinite amount of more information and knowledge and understanding to be gained about each of these things, but we want to just give you guys a general understanding of all of it. So we'll be discussing neural structures, neurons, how they communicate, what neurotransmitters do, how they influence us. This is a nice imagery of what a motor neuron looks like, and a neuron is a cell. If you see on the left side there, I don't know if you can see my asterisk here on the computer, but this is the cell's body, and this is the dendrites that reach out and receive messages. The axon is the opposite of a dendrite in a lot of ways because it's sending messages to other cells, dendrites, and there's that give and take. Axons sending messages to dendrites, and cells communicating and sending messages through the brain and through the body. So that's the big picture here: is neurons and different cells transmit information, help us process and to function really in life. These are the branches of the axons. This is the junctions where they would meet up with other cells and connect. We'll see another image of that. Along your axon, you have what's called myelin sheaths, and these are protective coatings that help essentially lubricate the process of the messages being sent across these neurons. There's the exchange of ions and different electrical exchange that causes the message to be sent, and that will be your neural impulse, your action potential, and that's the process of pretty much everything communicating in the brain. Very complex, but very simple at the same time. So a little more in depth, the neuron is a nerve cell that is the basic building block of our nervous system. We'll talk about the nervous systems later. It contains dendrites, like we talked about. They listen and the axons speak. So dendrites receive information, axons give the information. And what an exchange of information, or the electrical current, or that message being sent from an axon to a dendrite, from cell to cell, neuron to neuron, it's called an action potential. It's a nerve impulse. This is the brief electrical charge that travels down an axon and gets received by the dendrites. A glial cell is the cell in the nervous system that supports, nourishes, and protects neurons. It plays a really important role in our thinking and our learning and building memories. It also provides nutrients and myelin. And the myelin sheaths, again, are what kind of protect and insulate your axons of your neurons. The synapse is the junction point, the gap between your axon's tip and the dendrite. So they don't necessarily touch or connect. There's a void there that sends across different signals, chemicals, and hormones that can signal the next neuron to activate something. That synaptic gap or cleft is the tiny gap at the synapse. So there should be a picture. I think this is a unique and kind of a cool picture. This is a just jumble of neural patterns and connections. And if you can imagine, this mess distributed across billions of neurons is how everything functions in your brain and in your body and in our world. So humanity boiled down to this mess of webbing and different electrical currents sending messages is the start of a lot of things. Well, everything, actually. How neurons communicate. And we're breezing through this pretty quickly. If you have more questions, if you want to dive deeper, there's a lot in the chapter and a couple other slides as well. So each neuron is a miniature decision-making device, if you can imagine. It's passing along a message between each one, that axon to dendrite, and they're reacting to excitatory and inhibitory signals. So an excitatory signal, when it exceeds, so when you get enough of the same signal, that might exceed the threshold of your mind inhibiting something to act on it or to obey the signal or the message being sent. Combining enough signals triggers an action potential. That's when you would act on the neuron's message and what they're sending. And there's a good example coming up, but I'll get into it a little bit. For instance, if you reach out to touch something and you're uncertain of what it might feel like, if it's going to be like a pokey thing or if it's going to be soft, so you might be apprehensive and you have neurons sending some messages of concern, like, oh, we don't know if we want to touch this, it might hurt us, but we're curious and we're dumb, so we're going to try it anyways. And that's not enough maybe to exceed your threshold or that boundary to stop you from touching it, reaching out. And so you would reach out, but you'd be hesitant and you'd be more ready to pull back. And that's the action that your neurons are sending, is pull back, don't touch that. And so if you reach out and you touch say you're a young kid and you haven't learned that stovetops can be hot. So you reach out with your hand, and as soon as it touches that, you immediately get a flood of neural messages sending across those axons to the dendrites, and they immediately breach that threshold to say, get off, don't touch that. It's a much quicker response time than if you were reaching out to touch something soft or pleasant, or if you had learned in the past that stoves, are hot and you shouldn't touch them. So that's one of the examples we'll go through in a little bit of how different excitatory neurons overcome your inhibitory signals. And to inhibit something is to stop it or to filter it or to prevent it from happening. Refractory period is a brief resting pause that occurs after a neuron is fired, and this happens in a fraction of a second, something you wouldn't physically be able to notice even. More on neurons communicating. They have an all or none response. Neurons react by firing or not firing. There's not a lot in between. So a strong stimulus trigger means more neurons fire. So touching a hot stovetop, more neurons will fire. Touching something that you're just uncertain about, you're not sure if it'll hurt or not, less. And touching something you're familiar with that you know is not going to hurt, it's going to feel good even, that would have maybe no neurons firing at that time. Neurotransmitters is the neuron-produced chemical that cross that synaptic gap we talked about between the axons, the neuron, or the dendrites, and it carries the message to the other neurons or your muscles. And this is a process of reuptake That's when your neurotransmitters are reabsorbed back into the axon from which they're being sent. You don't want to waste any of those precious neurotransmitters. This is just a visual, what we just talked about. So if you see up on step 1, you see these two, I'm not sure again if you can see my mouse, but this is one cell or neuron sending across the myelin sheaths in the axon here to the dendrite, and the synapse here to another cell, and they would just form a chain or a web of connected neurons to send messages. And this is the axon, the action potential releasing neurotransmitters, and these little green guys are your neurotransmitters trying to get into receptor sites of the dendrite for the next cell. And they're paired with different chemical and electrical messages that try to receive and give the message to the next cell or neuron. So when an action potential reaches its axon end or the terminal, it stimulates the release of these neurotransmitters, and these molecules cross the gap, that synaptic void. And they bind to the receptor sites, to the receiving neuron, and this allows an electrical charge to the atom to enter the receiving neuron and excite or inhibit, depending on what action you're looking to take. The next step is the excess neurotransmitters. Again, that reuptake process are reabsorbed, they drift away, or they're broken down by different enzymes is what they're called to get rid of them. So how these neurotransmitters and all this process influences us. Neurotransmitters have their own pathways that deliver specific messages, and they influence the motions and emotions of our brain and our body. So the brain produces natural opioids, for example, known as endorphins, and opiates are different chemicals such as opium, morphine, heroin, things that depress neural activity. They relieve pain. These are a lot of drugs listed, painkillers or illegal substances that people use if they're hurting or they want to forget something or they want to numb what they're feeling. The brain has natural chemicals like that. These things obviously increase them. But that's an example of a neurotransmitter, is when you're experiencing something that's painful, your brain would say, oh, we need endorphins or serotonin, or if we're stressed, we need cortisol or we need serotonin to sleep. And these are the different chemicals, neurotransmitters that would be distributed and go through that action potential and then the reuptake phase to send messages in our brain for us to react accordingly. And you can understand that when psychological or biological issues happen is when this process doesn't work. For instance, if you don't have endorphins or different chemicals supporting you when you're sad or when your body's or when your brain is feeling distressed, your brain might adapt to that. It might not produce enough of them, or it might not release and connect the same rate that it would need to relieve stress, and that might become traumatizing. It might become depression, or it might become something that actually impacts someone in the long run. So again, at the source of all this, your biology, your neurotransmitters, and that interaction in the brain is really, really important. Moving along with the structure, the biology of our brain system is the nervous system. We'll talk about both its components, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So the nervous system is the body's speedy electrochemical communication network. This is what sends all these signals up and down throughout your body, your brain. And it consists of all the nerve cells of the central and peripheral nervous system, CNS, PNS. So central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. Think of it as the central base, your brain, and then there's a column that connects to your spinal cord, the brainstem, and then this distributes through your peripheral nervous system. And if you can think of peripheral as what you see without looking at it, so when you look straight forward, your peripheral is the things you pick up on the border of your eye or your retina. And so this is what the central nervous system sort of distributes throughout the rest of your body. Sensory and motor neurons connecting all of our muscles and our bones and everything like that. So types of neurons, you have sensory neurons, and this is where you would carry incoming messages from the body's tissue and sensory receptors to the spinal cord and the brain. You have motor neurons. This carries the outgoing instructions from the central nervous system to the body's muscles, tells your arm to move, pick up the pencil, and to write your name at the top of your page. Interneurons are present in the brain and the spinal cord, and they communicate internally and they process information between sensory inputs and motor outputs. They're kind of in between the two mentioned above. The peripheral nervous system, there's two parts, somatic and autonomic. The somatic nervous system controls the body's skeletal system or muscles. This is also known as the skeletal nervous system. And then the autonomic nervous system controls the glands and muscles of internal organisms or organs. So this is an automatic, like your lungs. You breathe without thinking, and most of your organs function without you having to control them. You don't have to think, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. It just kind of happens. Sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous systems are part of that autonomic nervous system, which is then part of our peripheral nervous system. So you can see how this hierarchy of nervous systems kind of gets more and more complex and more interactive. I guess we don't have anything on these two. That's okay. I've already discussed it enough. The next about the central nervous system, it consists of the brain and the spinal cord that we talked about. The brain is obviously an important organ in humanity. Without it, we wouldn't be humans. It's something that's evolved more in us than anything else. It contains 86 billion neurons that cluster into work groups, and they form networks, and they govern all our reflexes. The spinal cord is a two-way highway, essentially, connecting the peripheral nervous system and the brain. And so if you can think of it as like the 5, if you want to get in and out of LA, you have to take, well, not just the 5, but you have to take a highway or a freeway. Injury to any of these things could lead to loss of sensation, involuntary movement, anything damaging the spine, the spinal cord, the midbrain, or the brain itself would be very significant to you as a person. So very important we protect those things. That's why we wear helmets and seatbelts. So we kind of talked about this before, but a simple reflex. This is just the process in reaching out to touch, in this example, of a flame. So in this simple hand withdrawal reflex, information is carried from your skin receptors. Those are the sensory neurons. So you feel something and they go up through your skin, through your body, into your central nervous system, register in the brain, and then it sends something immediately outward. And this is the motor neurons, the blue, going back out to tell your finger and your hand and your arm to withdraw, to pull back. This is not something you want to experience. And again, we see this image and we think, wow, that's quite a process. It has to go up one way and come back the other way after being processed in the brain. But if you can remember the last time you touched something hot and pulled away immediately, that's how quickly your brain processes this. It's how quickly your body distributes, receives information, and uses it to make a decision. And if you're doing something like touching a flame, your body's going to make the decision for you for the most part and react by pulling back because your body does not like that feeling. We know it's bad for you. Obviously, you could hold your hand there, but it would take a lot of willpower, and you'd have to be denying or contradicting your brain's chemical reactions to this, and it'd have to be something you'd be very motivated to do if you were trying to burn yourself or do something. Step 2, because this reflex involves only the spinal cord, the hand jerks away from the candle's flame even before information about the event has reached the brain. This causes the experience of pain. Next, we'll talk about the endocrine system. This is a ton of your hormonal and different glands, systems that distribute hormones and nutrients and things of the like. So essentially, the endocrine system is it's a slow chemical communication system. It's all your glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. A hormone is a chemical messenger manufactured by the endocrine glands. They travel through the bloodstream. They affect our other tissues. The effects of the endocrine messages last longer than those of neural messages, and they typically dissipate at a slower pace. So they're there longer, they have a longer influence, they're more chronic, whereas a neuron is a pretty quick acting, fast release system. The adrenal glands, for example, are a pair of endocrine glands that sit above the kidneys. They secrete epinephrine or adrenaline and norepinephrine, which is noradrenaline, that help arouse the body during stress. Part of this process is what influences your flight or fight response. Fight, flight, or freeze is what it's often called. And this is when you're put in a situation, we'll talk about the amygdala in a little bit, but your body will react to danger in different ways. So you might fight if you feel your body is capable, or if your body reacts in a way where it wants to defend itself, or you might find yourself freezing because your body is paralyzed by the fear. And that would be the other option other than flight, where you would just run and you would have a lot of energy. If you've ever been in a situation where you had adrenaline, usually that adrenaline will just explode and it helps you use energy or maybe strength in a way to complete whatever your body needs to stay safe. And then it peters off, and typically you're exhausted afterwards. The pituitary gland is another part of the endocrine system. It releases hormones, sends messages to other endocrine glands to release their hormones. It's part of that important system of communication, and it is controlled by the hypothalamus. It'll secrete growth hormones for physical development and oxytocin that enables contractions during birthing and orgasms. Oxytocin is also a social chemical or hormone that when you're with other people, it helps you connect. This is known as the master gland. Moving forward, we're going to talk a little bit more about the brain. We've talked about the hormones, and we've talked about the neurotransmitters and the different ways our brain communicates. Now we're going to talk about what we've used in science to discover these things. Some more brain structure, cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer, and all the chunks and the sections of the brain. We'll do some critical thinking, and then talk about plasticity as well. So the human brain is obviously a very complex organism. When I was in college, I was able to study under a neuroscientist who called it the last frontier. And so he grew up reading a lot of Jules Verne or Sherlock Holmes and like mystery novels and adventure novels. And he said he wanted to be an adventurer. He wanted to pioneer, but there's not a lot of space left in the world that's not discovered, which is more or less not true. But the brain was something that had just 30 years ago, especially, infinite opportunity, because we were just starting to figure out how to measure things in the brain and how to analyze it, how to observe it, how we can work with it. And the main tools we use are these electroencephalograms, EEGs, where you put electrodes on the scalp. You've probably seen these in different movies. If you watch Stranger Things, Eleven has these hooked up to her when they start to experiment with her, measuring her brain waves. The positron emission tomography, which is a PET scan, is a different device used to depict where radioactive forms of glucose go in the brain. So it measures energy and communication in the brain. And MRIs, fMRIs, different tools started to develop in the last 30, 40 years that helped us understand the brain. And before that, we really didn't know as much about it. It was a lot of point and shoot, or a lot of guessing, essentially. So the human brain, today's neuroscience tools enable us to look under the hood, glimpse the brain at work, enabling the mind for us to better understand it. So it's a huge progress for psychology as well. I will say a little caveat. In my experience in neuroscience, anyone who speaks too confidently is probably overcompensating for something. We still know so little about the human brain. We're just now figuring out how it interacts with other organs and how across each hemisphere it interacts. So I always approach this with, again, some sensitivity and some caution, because we don't know nearly as much as what we think. Some of our older brain structures, so the less complex brain is primitive. In primitive vertebrates, will handle just basic survival functions. So find food, reproduce, stay alive. Those are your basic functions in a primitive brain. More complex brains in lower mammals, rodents are a common example, enables some emotions and greater memory. So mice actually are used in experiments that they try to generalize results to humans. And they would say that mice have some similar emotional and brain capacities and functions as humans. But as you climb the totem pole to more complex mammals, such as humans, we would be able to have much more complex brain function, like planning ahead, having more organization, more emotions, and other functions of the brain. So brain structure, we have the brain stem, which is the central hub of the brain. It's this column in the center of it. It's the oldest and innermost brain region. It's responsible for automatic survival functions. So without that, you're not going to get very far. The medulla is at the base, and this controls heartbeat and breathing, and it's used for regulating stress. So if you notice when you're stressed, your breathing happens faster and your heart rate goes up. Without this, we wouldn't be able to regulate that. And so it's an important part of evolving. And when we were more primitive species, we were obviously more stressed. We didn't know if we were going to live the next day. We didn't know how to survive as well. And so this part of the brain was much more active. Pons are another part of the brainstem that help coordinate movement and control sleep. We'll talk about sleep a little bit today. And this is just an image of that brainstem and where it's located in the brain. It's in that central part, reaches down, connects to your spinal column, and goes into that central peripheral nervous system we talked about. So the body's wiring, the brainstem, there's a crossover point. So your left hemisphere, if you see the blue side up here, is connected to the right side of your body, and the right side of the brain is connected to the left side of the body. So when you're moving your left arm, it's your right motor cortex that's coordinating it, and vice versa. When you're moving your right arm, it's to the left side of your brain. Some parts of the brain, the thalamus is the brain's sensory control center. It's located at the top of the brainstem, and it's directly responsible for sending sensory messages to the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. It transmits replies to the cerebellum, which is the back part of the brain. It helps decision-making and some motor movement. And the medulla, which we talked about, helps regulate our arousal, our heartbeat, our breathing. So the thalamus kind of helps pilot those things, navigate them. The reticular formation is the nerve network running through the brainstem and the thalamus. It acts as a filter that relays important information to other brain areas. So it helps kind of send messages to the right places. Plays an important role in controlling arousal. The cerebellum is the little brain. It's situated in the back of your brain, kind of sunk down in the bottom part of it. This aids in judgment of time, discrimination of sound and texture, emotional control, coordinates voluntary movement and life-sustaining functions, helps process and store memories of things that cannot be consciously recalled. I remember the cerebellum, there's some different neurotransmitters that coordinate movement. And when you're under the influence of alcohol or another drug, it'll impact those or inhibit them. And so they don't communicate with each other as effectively. We talked about that neurotransmitters sending messages from the axons to the dendrites to exchange information and to help you function. So when these are inhibited, they don't get the excitatory threshold they need. Our motor movements kind of get shoddy. So you see people stumbling around trying to coordinate themselves when they're under the influence. It's because part of their cerebellum is being influenced in a negative way. The limbic system is a neural system that lies between the oldest and newest brain areas. It's associated with emotions and drives. This includes your amygdala, your hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. It's a very important part of the brain in humans because there's a lot to do with emotions and memory and more complex processing in this area. So the parts that we just mentioned, the amygdala, they're the two lima bean-sized clusters that enable aggression and fear. They're linked to emotion. That fight, flight, or freeze response has a lot to do with the amygdala system. It helps regulate that. It helps determine what hormones are sent where to give you that adrenaline, or if you need to make a decision quickly, or if you need to be stronger, or whatever the situation calls for that's threatening you. The hypothalamus, linked to emotion and rewards, part of your reward system. So when good things happen, your brain likes it. It gets excited, and then it wants that happening more often. So it seeks out that stimulus to gain that reward. Its neural structure is positioned below the thalamus. It directs several maintenance activities. It helps kind of maintain its surrounding components. And it helps govern the endocrine system that we talked about via the pituitary gland. The hippocampus, can't see it. This helps process conscious, explicit memories of facts and events. So hippocampus is really an interesting part of the brain, and it stores a lot of your long-term or episodic memories. So important to have. It also coincides a lot with your emotional processing because our emotions are largely influenced by our memories. So if you have memories of a certain place, and let's say two people went to a certain place, and one person had a near-death experience, and that place has haunted them, and it's a very negative memory. That memory might influence them when they see things that remind them of that, or it might trigger sad emotions when they have similar experiences or surroundings. Whereas someone, if they went there and they had a great experience and they're very happy, their hippocampus might interact in a different way, leaving impressions of positive thoughts and memories. The hippocampus also, I read recently, is they're finding it's largely influenced by things we eat. So eating lots of red dye 40 and food coloring and processed foods has led to people having smaller hippocampus and having less memory storage or effective memory recall. Something to think about. The cortex of the brain, this is the outer layer, and then we'll talk about its subdivisions like the motor functions. So the cortex electrically stimulates parts of the brain and enables movements for the body and different body parts. The motor cortex, which is a strip along the center, kind of comes down each side of the head towards your ears. It controls voluntary movements, meaning things you're in control of. When they discovered this, the body part areas that have more precise control, so more specific or detailed control, have more amounts of space. So you'll have a bigger part of your motor cortex for your fingers and your hands than you will for, say, your thigh or your leg. The somatosensory cortex is the cerebral cortex area at the front of the parietal lobes. It's on the side of your head, above your ears again. This registers and processes body touch and movements and sensations. Sensitivity of a body region is directly related to the size of the somatosensory area that is devoted to it, similar to the motor cortex. And the cortex, again, is if you stretch something over the brain, it's that outer layer, and the brain kind of works in different ways, where you have sections that will go over the lobes, and then you have the crevices where you see these little like noodle things interacting and folding over each other, and then it goes upwards and outwards from your inner brain, your limbic system, and the brainstem, and then it goes to your cortical layers, and then the cortex is the outside of it. And then you have meninges, which protects you from infections, and it has like a more of a fluid layer, and there's a whole bunch of different components. Again, the brain is not just this one chunky thing in your head. It's very, very complex, obviously. The visual cortex, if you see here, is the back of the head. It's above your cerebellum, right below your, right above your neck, where your neck and your head meet. And this is where you process information that you receive through the eyes. So visual processing largely. The auditory cortex, right above the ears, ironically, and they help the temporal lobes, they help process information that you hear and receive through your hearing senses. So the brain in action, we have an fMRI, which again is that scan that looks for areas that are active and they light up on a brain scan. You can kind of tell which parts of the brain are involved with what activities. So this person was given a picture to look at, and you see the visual cortex and the occipital lobe light up. When the person stops looking, the region will start to calm down. So that's how we started to map out the brain and find which areas are coordinated with what, is we started looking at what areas light up when you do that activity, for instance. Other areas involved in higher mental functioning, the cortex, the prefrontal cortex, for example, is the front of your brain, and it's where a lot of things, kind of the driving seat of the brain. It's where a lot of things go through and get processed, and it's the most evolved in humans. Helps us make decisions, helps us start things, stay motivated, follow through with things, organize things, shift between things. Very important. All of those things are obviously very important in learning. So when you're going to school, you might find that you've been able to learn more things or different things and remember things as you grow older. It's because your brain is developing, especially that part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is not fully developed in males until around 27, 28, I believe. And females, I think it's 25 to 26, so it's fully developed. So in all four of the lobes, you have the parietal, the temporal, the occipital, the frontal lobes. The prefrontal cortex, what we just talked about, enables judgment, planning, processing of new memories, and any damage to this could be catastrophic. Could alter your personality. It could lead to, in the parietal lobes, it could lead to loss of mathematical or spatial reasoning abilities. The underside of your right temporal lobe, where you process information that you hear, it could lead to a different identity in a person. There's a lot of interesting case studies. We talked about the method of case studies last week a little bit. If you ever want to read Oliver Sacks, he's an author that writes on neuroscience case studies, and they're all very unique and interesting. Another case I'm sure we'll talk about in this class is the Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker, and a metal spike shot up through his skull right by his nose and ear, penetrated his frontal lobe and parts of his frontal cortex, and I think part of his temporal lobe as well. And after, well, he survived, obviously, not to spoil anything. But after months, he started to kind of digress, and his personality started to change. He was much more impulsive and angry. His whole family left him. A really sad story. But the case allowed for people to understand things about the brain and how it affects us, how it affects our personality, who we are. But also the plasticity that we started talking with is kind of a crucial part of that story, that we learn somebody who has a hole in their brain, some metal spike that shot through their head, they're still able to technically survive, and their brain still functions, just it had to find different ways to function. So in brain damage, effects are typically caused by neurons being severed, so they don't actually connect anymore, and oftentimes they won't repair themselves. Some brain functions that are forever linked to specific areas might be eliminated, and then attempts to repair itself have found to be pretty extraordinary. The reorganization of existing tissue kind of occurs where different synapses will connect, and neurons that used to connect that can't connect anymore will find other areas to connect and communicate. This is called neurogenesis, the formation of new neurons. Pretty incredible thing. So another case, an example of this is a 6-year-old girl. She had a surgery to end the life-threatening seizures she was having. Unfortunately, this removed, as you can see here, a huge portion of her brain. And a large reason, I'm sure, why this surgery was able to be even remotely successful is because she was so young. Her brain hadn't developed and created its connections as much in that area. So now it has time as she grows and develops to connect in different ways. So while this entire hemisphere is removed, this is an MRI scan here, her remaining hemisphere compensated by putting other areas to work. That compensation means that if it doesn't work one way, the brain will adapt and will try to find another way to make it work. So the brain is in the two hemispheres, the right and the left. The separation between them is called the corpus callosum. And this is a large band of neural fibers. White and gray matter is a little gooey chemical that's in your brain that helps transmit things. And it connects both the hemispheres. It carries messages between them. Split brain is the brain's hemispheres are isolated by severing the fibers that connect them. So that usually happens when somebody has debilitating seizures or one side of the brain is not communicating effectively with the next. Very rare that this would actually be a necessary surgery to carry out on someone. There are also conditions where your corpus callosum isn't working effectively. I was able to be on a research team. We researched mice that had a condition called agenesis of the corpus callosum, and that's where they don't have that midline fissure that connects both hemispheres of the brain. And they have a lot of brain damage and deficits, things that they couldn't do. So the brain is divided, and it typically splits across. Your right brain controls a lot of your left side, and your left brain controls a lot of your right side. There's different, I'm sure you've heard, I'm a right brain thinker, I'm a left brain thinker. So there's different functions each side of the brain typically does. The right side of the brain typically is more involved with inferences or coming to reasonable conclusions, and it's more artsy and it's more creative. It helps to fine tune things, whereas the left hemisphere is good at making quick, exact interpretations and using language in a pretty blunt way. A lot more goes into that, but for now, for time's sake, that's all we'll go over. So brain states and consciousness. This is a quick session. I'm gonna breeze through. The conscious awareness that we have of ourself and our environment is something that the brain enables. And this is important because in humans, we're able to exert voluntary control and to communicate mental states when we're conscious. And we're able to focus our attention, and we're aware of our physical space of what's going on. Now, some ways of altering this consciousness where our awareness is more alert and more active is meditation, or when you're daydreaming or sleeping, or different drugs and hallucinations can impact that. But sleep is the most natural one. So we'll talk about that the most. Skip some of these slides. So sleep and dreams, this will be the last thing we really talk about. There's a lot of slides on this, but I don't think it's worth reviewing in full. Typically, your biological rhythm has a 24-hour biological clock system that's based on the sun and the Earth's rotation around it. So you'll have typically 90-minute sleep cycles. We'll talk about your circadian rhythm, which is the internal clock that is set by the sun rising and setting. And different things that influence that. So rapid eye movement is the REM sleep cycles. This occurs during sleep stages, and it's characterized by dreaming or more vivid dreams. Ways we've studied this are similar to how we've studied the brain with the EEGs, looking at different alpha or beta waves and how they change as you go deeper into sleep. So the non-REM sleep cycle, number one, is characterized by irregular brain waves of the non-REM sleep stage. This is typically hypnagogic sensations that you're experiencing. And then non-REM sleep cycle two is when you're deeply relaxed, typically lasts 20 minutes, and you'll have bursts of rapid or rhythmic brain activity. And then sleep cycle three, you're getting deeper into your sleep stage. This could last about 30 minutes, and the delta waves start to emerge. And this is a chart just with the different activities in your different waking states or sleep cycles. But when you get into REM is when you're actually fast asleep. And for this part of sleep, the heart rate rises and breathing becomes rapid and irregular. Your eyes dart around, which is indicative of you dreaming. You typically have arousal during sleep, regardless of what your dreams are about or what context you're going through in your dream. And then your motor cortex is still active, but the brainstem blocks the messages from going outward. So it allows your muscles to relax. So a lot of important, crucial things happen in sleep. Your body, in a way, shuts down, and it allows your brain to still function, but it's at a slower pace and it's in a different way. So your body's able to recharge. The only time you're ever physically growing is when you're sleeping. And some things that I think are important, more practical things for us to dwell on is this circadian rhythm, or your biological clock is usually set by your melatonin, and you receive that through sunlight and seeing sunlight, but more importantly, being exposed to it. Having your body exposed to sunlight helps your body understand when to sleep and when not to. And they're finding out that different lights, mainly the ones in your TV and phone, cause this trigger in your mind to think that it's still daylight. So a lot of people will fall asleep next to their phone or looking at their phone. And a lot of people, before they go to bed, a ritual is to sit on their phone and to look at the light that can actually make you stay awake. And then you'll have problems sleeping. You'll have health issues. You won't be able to be as alert or awake. You might throw off your routine. A lot of negative implications, especially for young people. So it's something I find very important, is to shut off all the lights, to have your phone put away. I know there's that red light mode that shuts off some of the functions of your phone, so it doesn't trigger that, but it's still going to seep through and affect you a little bit. A lot of these slides are just on the impact of sleep. Because of time, I'm just going to leave it up to you guys to read them. They're not too crucial, and a lot of them are self-explanatory. Dreams are something that occur obviously while we're in sleep, and psychology has focused a lot of content on the interpretation of dreams. Dreams are, technically speaking, the sequence of images and emotions and thoughts passing through your mind while you're sleeping. They feature people and places from one's daily non-sexual experiences. And then there's different reasons why we theorize why we dream. So these are to satisfy your own wishes. If you're having unmet thoughts or feeling compromised, you might dream about what you wish was actually happening or your ideal life or situation. It's a way theorized to file memories and store information, a way to develop and preserve neural pathways to just repair the brain, to make sense of neural static, just the brain's bored and it has to do something with the noise, or to reflect on cognitive development. So, some theories behind these reasons why we dream. Freud would have told you that you dream to enact physical as a physical safety valve. So it's your brain's way of coping. So more vivid or longer or intense dreams you have, you might have some unresolved conflict or trauma in your life, and your brain is trying to get it out during your dream. So a lot of psychoanalysts who are rooted in Freudian theory would dwell primarily on your dreams in therapy. They want to hear all about the things you're having going on in your mind while you're asleep. The other theory, information processing, we talked about, sifting or sorting and securing the day's events, putting them in their memory stores, storing them away to have more effective memory recall, or developing and preserving the neural pathways. Dreams pave neural pathways by stimulating your experiences, making them more vivid. The neural static theory, making sense of random neural activity that spreads upward from the brainstem during sleep. As your brain shuts down and closes off part of your peripheral nervous system, those synapses go somewhere, and that's an idea of where they might go is to be processed in dreams. And then that last one, dreams reflect the dreamer's brain maturing and the cognitive development that it's undergoing. That is all for today. Hope that wasn't too long. But again, if you guys have any questions, always email. Hope everything is going well, and we'll see you for chapter 3.